In understanding the dynamics of Victorian and Proto-Victorian era politics, it is imperative that one understands the mentality of rulers of the great powers. What one must first realize is that the modern world today is a tripolar world, in which only about 2 or 3 nations can claim great power status. The world in the Victorian era had anywhere between 8 to 10 major powers in competition with each other at any given time. The world was viewed as a game of chess to the various heads of state, in which pieces were moved back and forth on a chessboard with careful placement as not to upset the balance of power towards any one nation, an idea coined in the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by Prussia, Austria, and the chaotic state of the Russian Empire under Catherine and Peter. For every territorial gain that would strengthen one empire, another empire saw fit to match the former's gains in order not to fall behind. Nations were all slowly growing at a roughly the same rate. In order to maintain a balance of power, of course, maintaining the balance of power is not an achievable task, as the strains of industrialization worked as a litmus test of adaptability in this new crucible of empires. Some nations coped well with the shift in production paradigms. Britain, France, and Prussia were very quick to adopt industrial methods, while some nations lagged behind. In the East and the Mediterranean, the embracement of the industrial institution was slow, due to the lack of readily available coal and machinery. Spain, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire were having a hard time adapting to the changing times, but specifically the Ottoman Empire was in dire straits. Their nearly 700-year-old dynasty of sultans was unable to make concessions towards a more advanced empire in favor of defending the old order and keeping the empire almost completely rural and agrarian, with the exception of a few leased factories amidst their changing world. Sultan Abdulmesid I, like many other monarchies rushing towards their demise, was a feckless tyrant without any power of government aside from attempting to convince the warlords who actually ran the country to change things. The Sultan, for the duration of the Crimean War, will remain a spectator. One can draw parallels between the slow demise of the Ottoman Empire with the now withering Qing dynasty under the Xuantong Emperor, which too was subject to constant molestation by foreign powers, in the many trade and naval squabbles that they had at the hand of the colonial neighbors. Because of this disparity, the ever-expansionist Russian Empire under Nicholas I saw weakness in the Ottomans, and saw fit to conquer their land at their expense. But, in order to cut the Ottomans down to size, he needed an excuse to justify hostile actions towards this sick man of Europe. The Tsar of Russia declared himself the protector of Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire, a title which had not existed before the Tsar chose to declare himself such a title. The conflict occurred when the fledgling Emperor of France, Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, desperate for a way to prove his legitimacy, contested Tsar Nicholas for the title of protector of the Christian minorities. With both volatile personalities at play, the dynamic of honor comes into being, as neither monarch could stay to delegate the imaginary title. Hence, in 1853, the Russians declared a state of war between themselves and the faltering Ottoman Empire, with the French quickly mobilizing their fleet in response, waiting for the opportune moment with their British allies to make their move. Firstly, engaging the problems that this war will incur, one is to simply look at a map of Europe to see the major issue in this. The problem of sufficiently forming an active border in order to combat one's opponents. Russia and the Ottoman Empire have 2 borders, and neither of which is conducive to large-scale warfare, and the lesser of the 2 fronts is the Caucasus, namely of which Armenia and Georgia would be host to maneuver campaigns on both sides. The other front arises equally challenging dilemmas. The Ottoman Empire had 2 Romanian puppet states to the north, which act as a buffer zone between them and Russia. The states of Moldavia and Wallachia, like other Christian peoples finding themselves under the Ottoman rule, resents the dogmatic Islam which holds power in their land. Like many of the other crises in the Balkans, the question of sovereignty rears its ugly head. So when the Russian army requests for permission of the Romanian puppet states to allow the Russian armies to have transit through their land, the Romanians have open arms for their Slavic savior to the east. The Ottoman Land Army, or the Osmanli Ordusu, was behind technologically to almost every other major power. Even when, well into the 1800s, there was still debate inside military headquarters questioning the effectiveness of muskets in favor of short bows, and debating other topics which had been considered no-brainers in the other great powers of Europe. In June 1853, a Russian army numbering almost 100,000 crosses the Danube, in collaborating with the Romanian territories, with even a number of Romanian irregulars joining the ranks of the Russians to fight against the Turkish men under the command of Omar Pasha. The fortification doctrine of the Middle Ages was resurfacing at this time period, and many nations began to build vast arrays of coastal and land fortifications. But rather than have a castle standing tall above ground, the doctrine has shifted to have gigantic, protected military command and reinforcement positions along important rivers and roads, in order for the nation's military to have a defensive position which could hold itself against a larger force. Siege warfare, again an aspect of war being abandoned for almost 200 years, resurfaced. These modern fortresses were more or less gigantic fortified concrete blocks, with artillery barbettes protruding awkwardly from walls and corners. These cinder block coffins were rarely actually built or used in warfare, as the expenses of building and maintaining these fortifications was more or less not worth the reward militarily, meaning that whenever they are built, a specific purpose was intended. For example, the Swiss built large fortified bases on their non-mountainous borders to maintain their neutrality. Although Switzerland could have been defeated if a major power were to attack, they could bring down their opponent's casualty rates numbering 100 to 1, in a sort of I can't hurt you but I can kill you move. The Ottomans had one such fort near the mouth of the Danube River, a position overlooking a hillside with guns bristling and enough supplies to last for 3 years. The doorway to Constantinople would be shut without this fortress and its garrison destroyed. Week by week, the Russian and Romanian forces marched onwards, fighting the disorganized Turkish militias in their wake, poised to strike Fortress Silistra with their newly acquired mortars until the message was delivered to Field Marshal Gorchakov. The message? Sent directly from the Austro-Hungarian attaché, insisted that they return to Russia and abandon Romania or suffer intervention by the Austro-Hungarian army in retaliation for the Russian aggression. Austria-Hungary, after having recovered from its revolution in 1849, addressed the place of minorities in the empire, and having mustered its forces to such an extent that it could again project force in a form of a powerful land army. For Russia to fight another major power on such short notice would be catastrophic, so the Russians turned their back on Silistra, and with them any momentum they might have had was left floating in the Danube like so many corpses. With Austria-Hungary blocking any advance into Europe and the mountain warfare in the Caucasus being a stalemate, fighting more or less died down. On the seas, however, Russia was having much more luck. The Baltic fleet, under Admiral Nahimov, sailed completely around the European peninsula, right through the English Channel. Although France and Britain had not yet declared support for the Ottomans, the passing of the Russian battle fleet through their territorial waters egged them closer to declaring the negation of their neutrality. At the 30th of November, 1853, the Baltic fleet arrived in the Black Sea, after having passed through the Straits of Constantinople unscathed. Neither the Russians nor the Ottomans cared much for their navies, as they were not the focus of their military expenditure, but the Russians had installed experimental explosive shell artillery cannons on their ships, in lieu of smoothbore cannonball firing weapons. This experimental weapon was neglected by many other naval powers due to its unreliability and cost, but this minuscule Russian fleet could afford to take the gamble. The Ottoman fleet was anchored at the port city of Sinop. This was not a battle fleet, but a supply convoy fleet for the Ottoman Caucasian forces in Armenia. Lacking any meaningful warships to counter the Russian heavy wooden battleships, the battle was a disaster for the Ottomans, with almost the entirety of their fleet destroyed or ran aground by their panicked captains and crews. The Russian explosive shells crushed into the hulls of the vulnerable wooden ships, and were quick to set alight the gunpowder magazines. The wooden Ottoman frigates exploded with such a magnitude that in some cases none of the crew survived, say a couple hands or feet floating in the water. The underfunded and underpaid Russian Navy had solidified themselves in glory as their branch of service was again made relevant to the minds of the high command. The Russian fleet took thousands of Turkish sailors prisoner and returned to their base in Sevastopol as heroes, with next to no losses sustained for themselves. Sevastopol, what horrors unknown to the returning sailors as to what would happen to this beautiful city. Remember that this war was started in order to maintain the Tsar's honor. With this plucky, inexperienced Russian fleet destroying a large amount of the Ottoman navy, Britain's honor was called into question as to who actually had control over the waves. With Britain beginning preparations for hostility, and the French were also ready to commence hostilities toward Russia, to claim the imaginary title of protector of the Christian minorities, Britain and France buried the 800-year-old hatchet and formed an alliance on the 3rd of April, 1854, to curb Russian expansion at the Ottomans' expense, to regain the honor of Napoleon III, and to humiliate the Tsar into conceding defeat to the alliance. One of the first problems that the Allied forces encountered almost immediately was the need to transport their forces from depots in France and Britain to the Ottoman mainland. Steamships were still a new and impractical technology on a large scale, so the majority of men would have to travel in cramped wooden sailing ships from Britain all the way to Turkey. The slow and arduous process of transporting men and supplies would culminate in stretched supply lines, which will be foreboding in the future. The second issue is the matter of manpower and human resources. The French were adept at maintaining their effective land army overseas because of their experience in Algeria and Tunisia, in defeating the numerous tribes and Beylik states in the desert. Britain had not needed an expeditionary force since the end of the Napoleonic era. Thus, the small yet professional army of Britain was completely disillusioned by the process of sailing and occupying a foreign land, as they had not done so in over 30 years. The British and French landed near Silistra Fortress at the Bulgarian city of Varna, where they had set up camp. For 4 months, while waiting for the navy to stockpile supplies in Constantinople, the British and French sat in camp waiting. Cholera and disease quickly set into the armies, and over the course of their time waiting, nearly 40,000 men died from disease and pestilence. 40,000 men dying without even having fired a shot at the Russians, which they had come to humiliate. This was a blow to the Allied morale, with any fighting spirit washed away with the cholera-infested diarrhea. However, the signal was given, all preparations were made. On the 10th of September, the Allied forces boarded their ship to meet their destiny in the Crimea. The jewel of the Crimean Peninsula is home to the most important port city of Sevastopol. If this city were to be captured, the entirety of the Crimean Peninsula would be under Allied influence. Being a peninsula, Crimea has only one land route from the mainland of Russia. The narrow stretch of land to the north, which could easily be defensible to whatever side in control of it. Although the Russians have an ace in their hull, the city of Sevastopol is converted from an ancient fortress from the Crimean Khaganate from hundreds of years ago. Walls and towers ring the fortress city of Sevastopol, and the Russian Navy had purposely sunk the Baltic Fleet in order to make an underwater wall stopping any Allied ships from entering its harbor and committing shore bombardments. The Baltic Fleet, which the British had sailed all the way across Europe to destroy, had sunk themselves. Admiral Nakhimov became the head of the Russian garrison at Sevastopol. Under his leadership, the already fortified city became a fortress to match the unscathed fortress of Silistra. The Russian paradigm had shifted from full-scale offensive to a defensive operation for the remainder of the war. The British army was under the command of the aristocratic and aloof Lord Raglan, a man who got his experience and taste for war during the Napoleonic era, and had a deep distrust for the French, often telling his advisors to discard the French orders, and he was hesitant to bring in new supplies and reinforcements. He was joined by 2 French generals, General François Canrobert and General Leroy de Saint-Arnaud. Both the Frenchmen were far more open towards reinforcements and much more adept at operating their land army, as both of them had been leaders in the Algerian War. Leading the Ottoman expedition was Omar Pasha, a Christian convert to Islam who had been taken prisoner during the Battle of Sinop, but had managed to escape back into Allied hands. In a hasty display, the French, British, and Ottoman expeditions sailed from Varna and upon the shores near the river Alma, just north of Sevastopol, on the 14th of September. The landing was quick and effortless, and the renewed movement of the army reinvigorated the soldiers and dulled the haze of cholera that they had received at Varna. In the event of 4 days, the entirety of the expeditionary force landed. Over 100,000 men occupied the beaches north of Sevastopol, and the Russian scouts began surveying the British landing. Across the river and atop the hills, the Russian army under Prince Menshikov began to dig in. Trench positions and artillery batteries were built in a haste, and to an outside observer one would think that this Russian defensive position would be impregnable. But the rod of distrust was eating away at the Russian generals. 6 days after the Allies had landed in the Crimea, they began to march towards Sevastopol, and directly into the Russian defenses. 60,000 Allied infantry and cavalry began their advance across the river, towards the Russians of under half their number. Poorly trained Russian soldiers commanded by Menshikov, who had greatly overestimated the ability of his troops in the face of superior numbers and odds. As the Allied forces crossed the river, they were raked by cannon fire and bullets, and in the frenzied madness charged up the hills into the hands of the Russians. The fighting was intense, desperate hand-to-hand combat between the outnumbered Russians and the enraged British. The Russians were forced to retreat and abandon Alma, retreating to their secondary position at Balaclava, south of Sevastopol. In understanding why the Russians performed so badly at Alma, it's important to understand the positions of the different Russian regiments in the battle. Half of the forces were atop the hillside, and the other half were guarding a secondary position away from the action. The already beleaguered Russian army was destroyed at Alma Hill, and the other half, which had not been committed to the battle, was left free to retreat. Had Prince Menshikov committed his entire force at the River Alma, the war could have very well went into his favor, thus stopping the Allied attack dead in their tracks, and quite possibly taking the entire Allied expedition as prisoners, essentially ending the war in a stalemate. After Alma, the Russians never were really able to recover from their defeat, and for the remainder of the war, they will be left grasping at straws for a chance to try to stop the Allied onslaught. A month after Alma, the Allied forces moved southward in order to besiege Sevastopol and put an end to the war. But the beachhead that had been captured at Alma was insufficient to bring in more supplies from Varna, so in order to solidify Allied presence in the Crimea, it was imperative to capture another vector of the invasion. Just south of Sevastopol was a fishing village called Balaclava, which had a dockyard which would be perfect for the Allies to have as a supply depot in the Crimea. So on the 25th of October, the British and French met with the Russians in a series of skirmishes in the road towards Balaclava. In this pursuit warfare, cavalry is of the utmost importance, as scouting and encirclement became crucial tactics. In the pursuit towards Balaclava, an artillery position was shown to be vulnerable, and the famous Light Brigade was dispatched to the site in order to capture the hill. But, unbeknownst to the cavalry, they've been given faulty orders, and they're sent charging in the wrong direction, right into the amassed cannonade of the Russian artillery. The mistake had been immortalized in poem, as the famous charge of the Light Brigade, a romanticist work of heroism and bravery in the face of death.
Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade! Charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade! Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600.
The Russian army had withdrawn from Balaclava, where tens of thousands lay dead. The retreating force had moved into the city of Sevastopol to build up defenses and garrison the city under Admiral Nakhimov. In a lightning-fast campaign, the city had been almost completely surrounded and cut off from the outside world. About 80,000 soldiers and volunteers had become protectors of the city, and had enough supplies to last for years. But with the British building artillery positions and winter quickly setting in, the war will quickly become a frozen bloodbath. In addition to the reinforcements of the siege, an army group from the Italian kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont was sent as a diplomatic move in order to build relations with France in order to begin their campaign to unify Italy. But that's a story for another day. The final major battle with the Russians occurred the 5th of November, 1854, in the forests of Inkerman. The battle happened in the early morning, and the fog had not yet cleared from the dense hedges and vineyards. The armies scoured the forest for each other, and firefights in the damp fog quickly devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The bayonets and swords of the men glistened red that afternoon, and by the end of the slaughter over 15,000 men had met their demise. With the Russians passively encamped around the British, trenches were dug in order to build an effective deterrent from continual assault. The trenches, resembling the ones which will be seen in the First World War, became a common occurrence, and men began to live in the most squalid conditions thus seen in warfare. The conditions of life around Sevastopol had quickly deteriorated as the frost began to set in, and winter approached. The Russians in the city, with thick woolen coats, warm houses at their disposal, and supplies to last for days, were scoffing at the dysfunctional English amidst the winter. The British supply shipments had stopped, or had become constantly delayed by bad weather, ice, or muddy roads. The supplies were left in ports at Balaclava without any way of reaching the front. The British and French were dressed in their summer uniforms, and many froze to death by thousands by the week. And in the midst of all of this, Generals Raglan and Arnault died of natural causes. The constant influx of wounded men overwhelmed the feeble British field hospitals, as the frostbite took their limbs, and thousands of men were receiving amputations per day. Medical science was still in its primitive state. Amputations were the prescribed treatment for pretty much everything. Painkillers and anesthetics were not yet existent past a couple sways of whiskey, and germ theory was still in its infancy. Thus, medical tools were constantly in use without being cleaned. Gangrene, frostbite, suicide, and cholera killed hundreds of thousands of British, French, Italian, and Ottoman soldiers. While the Allies froze to death, the situation of the city was quickly becoming murderous. The constant artillery bombardments on the city would level entire neighborhoods, and occasionally a gunpowder magazine would be struck, igniting entire blocks of houses on fire. The Allied shells indiscriminately killed thousands, from young children in the streets to crashing into people's bedrooms at night. In the midst of all of this, the famous author Leo Tolstoy had almost an entire year to write his works. The relative lack of action for the garrison and the shortage of artillery shells led for Tolstoy, an artillery officer, the perfect time to reflect on life, and during his most agreeable time in the siege, wrote many essays and stories. The Russians in the Caucasus were already in a defensive mode from the beginning, as the nature of the mountains led to impossibly impractical terrain for both sides to maneuver in. Thus, for an entire year, the British and French waited and starved, and the Russians waited and built fortifications, and the Ottomans sank further into the pit of dependency on foreign powers. The situation changed, however, as the supply issue was slowly alleviated for the Allies, from a short railway being constructed in Balaclava and the front in Sevastopol. Finally, a proper route for supplies to travel to the besieged forces had been established. This in turn allowed for continual artillery bombardment with the added benefit of specifically designed siege cannons fresh from the factory. The situation deteriorated for the Russians in Sevastopol, and large breaches in the walls were opened by heavy shelling. The time for action was called, and on the 18th of June, 1855, the Allies assaulted two fortified areas outside the city, the Malakoff and the Great Redan. The fighting was brutal, but the Russian garrisons ultimately repulsed the Allied forces. Hobbling away whilst licking their wounds, the French and British retreat back into their camps, and for 2 full months they unleashed the full fury of their cannonade. Millions of shells and cannonballs strike the city. Any morale the Russians had at this point was quickly gone as the shells disturbed their sleep for weeks on end. Supplies were running thin, ammunition depots were either empty or a flaming wreck, and the Russians slowly lost all will to fight. But the British blockade against the Russians was quickly becoming effective. The Baltic Sea and the inland Sea of Azov were no longer under Russian influence, and the British seized any and all shipping to and from Russia. Foreign goods in the home front were becoming scarce, and the economy of Russia was quickly becoming unstable. The second assault against the city was more or less a formality at this point. The last desperate hurrah for the defenders was at the Second Battle of the Malakoff, where 23,000 French and Russians fell. After 3 months of fighting and attrition, the great empires of the world could only step back and witness the horror this war had incurred. Over 1 million soldiers and civilians alike died from the devastation of this conflict. But, at last, a treaty was agreed upon. The points of this longly deliberated treaty go as follows. 1. Russian demobilization. Any and all Russian naval activity to be ceased in the Black Sea. 2. Revoke influence over Romania. The Romanian states become solidified into the Ottoman Empire. 3. Humiliation. The Tsardom was forbidden to claim titles over foreign peoples and in relation to other nations. 4. Revoke sphere of influence. Serbia, Montenegro, Wallachia, and Moldova remain in Ottoman sphere of influence. 5. Demolish fortifications. Bommersund, Åland, Sevastopol, and other fortresses must be demolished by the end of the year. 6. Monetary reparations. Russia would give large sums of money to the Allied powers in order to help the families of the deceased. And alas, the war had ended.